Welcome back. If you're trying to make sense of complex situations quickly, you're in the right place.
That's what we aim for.
Today, we're digging into the Ukraine conflict. Specifically, why does a truce seem, well, so out of reach right now?
It's a tough question. We'll be looking at it through the lens of key figures, President Zelensky and President Trump mainly.
Right. Trying to understand their perspectives, their motivations, maybe their strategies, as far as we can tell.
Exactly. Our mission here is just to unpack that, bring some clarity to what might be driving things behind the scenes.
Okay, so let's start with President Trump. There's this feeling, isn't there, that his stance is shifting?
There is, yeah. Especially after President Zelensky's visits to the White House. It sort of feels like Trump might be looking to distance himself a bit.
Distance how?
Well, the thinking, or the current impression, let's say, is that he might be signaling, okay, Ukraine, you can fight for your pre-91 borders.
Maybe not with direct U.S. help.
Kind of. Like, that fight might be yours alone without the same level of American involvement we've seen. But again, it's an impression. Things can change fast.
Sure. It's fluid. But that idea, Trump stepping back, it seems tied into this story about an agreement, right? One that never got signed.
Ah, yes. That's a really curious piece of the puzzle. An agreement, apparently Zelensky himself initiated it.
He initiated it.
That's the report. But then, despite multiple chances, Besant's visit to Kiev, the Munich Security Conference, even Zelensky's own trip to the White House.
3 times.
3 times, it seems. The opportunity was there, but no signature. It just didn't happen.
Which makes you wonder what was really going on there.
Exactly. And it kind of connects to some of Zelensky's media choices, too, like appearing on CBS.
CBS. That's interesting because Trump is in this huge legal fight with them, isn't he?
A massive one, seeking, $20 billion? Essentially trying to shut them down or severely damage them because he sees them as so anti-Trump.
So Zelensky goes on that network, and the journalist interviewing him had just been focusing on, aid victims in Gaza.
Yeah, and reporting from Kryvyi Rih about Palestinian children. It's not the most obvious choice if you're trying to curry favor with the White House,
Seems like a deliberate move, maybe. And then there was that whole thing with Pence, too.
Oh, right. Zelensky invites Pence, and Pence basically says no, calling it a propaganda trip.
Wow. That's blunt. It really shows a split in how people are viewing this, doesn't it?
Definitely highlights a growing divergence. And if you pull on that thread, you get to this proposed agreement about Ukraine's mineral resources.
Ah, the minerals deal.
Yeah.
That kept changing, didn't it?
It did. American media reports, Ukrainian officials, they all indicated it was constantly being revised, but the details were murky.
Nobody really knew what was in it.
Not publicly, not clearly.
Yeah.
Apparently, Ukrainian media only got hold of what's been described as Zelensky's sort of propaganda version after Besant showed it to him.
So they didn't even have copies at first because Zelensky wouldn't sign.
That's the report, yeah. A real lack of transparency around it.
And then the Financial Times dropped that bombshell.
Right. They reported on the actual content, or what they understood it to be, and used language suggesting Trump was effectively demanding to buy Ukraine.
Which sounds pretty extreme. But how should we understand that kind of agreement? Usually the one giving the aid sets the terms, don't they?
Typically, yes. An agreement like this, initiated by the providing party, Trump, in this case signing it, would imply U.S. protection for those assets. They become ours, in a sense.
Okay, so there's a security angle.
But also opens the door to external management, potentially. Especially given Ukraine's, known issues with corruption historically.
I see. So maybe that's why Zelensky hesitated, the control aspect.
That's one possibility, but there's also speculation about more personal reasons.
Like what?
Like maybe the deal didn't include guarantees for his own political future, his personal security, maybe a desire to remain president indefinitely.
And the idea is Trump wouldn't support that. Maybe even an agreement with Putin.
That's the speculation out there, yes. That staying in power was the priority, and this deal didn't secure it for him.
So if that's the case, Zelensky sees the fuss over the unsigned agreement, maybe sees his ratings tick up, and decides to run with it, present himself as fighting off both Putin and Trump.
It certainly looks like a strategic choice from that perspective, portraying himself as standing firm against both, which, plays well domestically sometimes.
Even if some might see it as putting popularity ahead of, national interest.
That's the criticism, yes. And these ratings, they seem genuinely central to his thinking. It's not just a side issue.
Like with the Minsk agreements before.
Exactly like Minsk. Remember, he won that election with 73%, huge mandate, promising to talk to Putin to find peace.
Which meant dealing with Minsk, signing something.
It did. But then came all that pressure not to sign. Activist groups, you mentioned USI links potentially.
And that letter from 70 organizations.
Yeah, urging him, don't sign anything with Putin. The proposal then involved federalization, which Surkov had apparently discussed with Putin.
Leading Putin to wonder why Zelensky was even going to Paris.
Right. It was already fraught.
So you see a parallel between that and the White House situation now.
You can draw one, yeah. Think about Minsk. Zelensky publicly almost laughing at that press conference with Putin.
I remember that.
And then basically doing none of the things Ukraine agreed to, while blaming Putin for not doing his part and saying Minsk was against Ukraine's interests anyway.
It sounds like a pattern.
The argument is there's a pattern of abandoning or turning against those who helped bring him to power. Trump being maybe just the latest example, driven by ratings.
And this focus on ratings, it even affected things before the full-scale invasion.
That's the suggestion. Denying the war was coming, even with U.S. intelligence warnings.
Why? To keep ratings high. Avoid awkward questions about not signing Minsk.
Potentially. It prioritized his political standing over acknowledging the imminent danger. And then there was the Istanbul Agreement chance.
Another missed opportunity.
A potential off-ramp, yeah. Could have saved countless lives, but it likely would have cost Zelensky his power.
So the analysis boils down to, his main goal now is just staying in power.
That's what this perspective suggests. Using the war as the reason to delay elections indefinitely until the 91 borders are restored.
Which seems a long way off, given the military situation, emigration, desertion.
It seems very challenging, yes. Millions unregistered, millions fled. It makes the 91 border goal look distant.
So what happens with elections?
Two theories, really. Either keep delaying because of the war, or maybe call snap elections while his ratings are still high from the telethon effect.
Could he win now?
Possibly, especially if Zelensky doesn't run against him. It could be like Putin in 2004 consolidating power in a crisis.
So the war itself becomes a tool for personal power retention.
That's the conclusion this line of analysis reaches. It suggests he didn't initially plan for this war, maybe thought he could keep provoking NATO, pulling the crocodile's whiskers without major consequences.
And believed the U.S. would back a proxy war completely.
Perhaps. You saw those articles in the New York Times, the Times, about massive U.S. and U.K. involvement, military intelligence planning.
So he might have expected more. Maybe even unrealistic things.
Like the U.S. taking out Putin, Ponomarev becoming president of Russia, Ukrainian tanks rolling to Vladivostok.
Wow. And then blacklisting Russians, dividing up Russia's resources.
These were apparently some of the, let's say, more ambitious ideas floating around certain circles. Highly unrealistic, probably.
But the American view, or the pragmatic view, was that real success needed total mobilization.
Pretty much. Getting, say, 2 million young men, 1825, into the fight.
Which Zelensky knew would tank his ratings and devastate a generation.
Exactly. So you have this gap between the rhetoric, the telethon talk of genetic slaves, and greater Ukraine, and the reality on the ground.
Where lots of men are avoiding service, which happens in any war, frankly.
It's normal, yes. But it contrasts sharply with the existential war narrative. If you look at Finland versus the Soviets or Israel in 48,
mobilization rates were sky high then.
Much, much higher. And then you have the immigrants in Europe living on benefits, often strongly pushing the greater Ukraine line.
Because their ability to stay depends on the conflict continuing in a certain way.
That's a potential factor, yeah. It adds another layer.
And then there are those contradictory statements about what happens after the war if Ukraine retakes territory.
Right. Podolyak suggesting most Crimeans would have to leave. Budanov, Politsa talking about disenfranchising people not fighting, or even posting supportive things online.
And propagandists talking about dealing with collaborators. It sounds harsh.
It does, and it begs the question. Is a war that might require cleansing 500,000 people from Crimea really an existential war for the nation? Especially when mobilization isn't total.
Or is it existential for something else?
Maybe existential for the system Zelensky has built. The idea being floated is transforming Ukraine into something like a Hamas or Gaza Strip model, reliant on conflict and external aid.
Which brings us back full circle almost to Minsk. That old narrative about Donbas being a cancer, Putin was forcing on Ukraine?
A view some held, yes. But now, seeing Ukrainians punished for speaking Russian, it makes you rethink that framing.
Because the geopolitical reality is
Ukraine is in Russia's sphere of interest. Both Putin and Trump seem to recognize that. Trying to create a purely nationalist Galicia from sea to sea, calling to decolonize Odessa, that's bound to cause conflict.
Trump even ranked the blame recently, didn't he?
He did. First, it was Zelensky and Biden, then Putin third. Later, he clarified. Putin first, then Biden, then Zelensky.
But the argument we're exploring suggests maybe all three share responsibility.
You could argue that. If Zelensky had signed Minsk back when Trump was president, maybe no war. He pursued a policy based on what Brzezinski called fake promissory notes regarding NATO expansion, unsupported hopes.
And he maybe misread the U.S. side, believed the Democrats were fully behind him, like those newspaper articles suggested.
Possibly. While the reality in parts of the Democratic Party, the State Department might have been more cynical, let Ukraine bleed to weaken Russia, but no consensus on who pays the final price.
What about Putin's role in all this? He didn't manage things well initially either.
Definitely not. He failed to keep a balance. Even after Maidan, he still had popularity in Ukraine. Russian language was strong, but allowing it to get to this point, a major failure. The global narrative now favors the small victim state, making his position harder.
And his view goes back to the first Maidan, 2004, believing the U.S. orchestrated it.
That seems to be his firm belief. He'd point to the U.S. ambassador boasting about supporting the protests. Then, under Yushchenko, all the Ukrainization.
Closing Russian papers, schools, forcing Ukrainian language even where people weren't fluent.
Right, which likely pushed Putin towards someone like Yanukovych, despite his flaws, the stolen hat stories and all that.
But Yanukovych did win an election, showing support from Russian speakers.
He did. Then came the second Maidan. Yanukovych ordering the crackdown, the violence, and crucially the shootings on February 20th, the Heavenly 100.
And this is where Professor Kochanowski's research comes in.
Yes. Ivan Kochanowski, teaching in Ottawa. His detailed work, backed by later info and even Kyiv court data, suggests something controversial.
Like?
That the shots hitting the Maidan protesters came from the Hotel Ukraine.
Which was controlled by Maidan activists.
Specifically, the Svoboda Party, according to this research. And at the same time, shots were apparently fired from the hotel at the Berkut police, who then returned fire.
And the bullet trajectories support this, coming from above.
Entering bodies at an angle from above, yes. That's the core of Kochanowski's thesis.
So if Putin believed that he and Yanukovych were being blamed for shootings actually carried out by far-right Maidan elements.
That, the argument goes, was the breaking point, the point of no return, leading to Crimea, the willingness to sign Minsk, which was then rejected, and eventually this war.
Because he felt fundamentally lied about and set up.
That's the interpretation. And now he sees an opportunity.
Because Trump sees Zelensky as a deep state client. The war is a deep state project.
Exactly. Putin largely agrees with that view, it seems. He thinks if he plays his cards right, Trump will pull the U.S. out.
So for Putin, this is his chance.
An existential opportunity, perhaps, to reclaim historical territory and deal a decisive blow to the current Ukrainian state project.
But wait, how does this square with, say, earlier views calling Putin a war criminal needing psychiatric help? Those tweets from 2022.
Yeah, that's acknowledged as, well, a past stupidity is the word used, similar to maybe some current Democratic rhetoric about Trump.
So influenced by the prevailing narrative at the time.
The suggestion is yes. From 2014 on, the liberal media narrative was strong. Maidan shooting was Yanukovych Putin. Ukraine was flawless on language rights. Putin was a fascist aggressor.
And believing that narrative led to disillusionment later, when Zelensky's government said things perceived as hostile.
When they were told to go back to Russia and overthrow Putin, when Yermak called dissenters Natsiks to be killed, when the propaganda called them genetic slaves and talked of dismembering Russia, that caused a reevaluation.
So the core problem from this viewpoint is Zelensky as a toxic manipulator.
That's the term used. Initial sympathy for the victim is natural, but the constant manipulation, the demands to repeat narratives seen as false, like Russia shelling Belgorod itself or downing the Kramatorsk missiles. Lots to think about.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.